Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb's voice echoed off the concrete walls of the breaching facility at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. 6 SEAL candidates stepped away from the reinforced steel door, sweat pouring down their faces despite the cool California morning. 45 minutes. That's how long they'd been hammering at this door, and the damn thing hadn't budged an inch. Again! Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb shouted, his voice echoing off the concrete walls of the breaching facility at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. 6 SEAL candidates stepped back, sweat pouring down their faces despite the cool California morning. They'd tried everything: the battering ram, explosive charges at the hinges, pry bars, lock picks, shotgun breaching rounds. Nothing worked. The door was part of a new training evolution, a simulation of a fortified enemy compound with security measures that mimicked what operators might face in the field. Multiple locks, reinforced frame, armored core. It was designed to be difficult, but not impossible. At least that's what the training cadre had been told when the facility was installed 6 months ago. "This is pathetic," Webb said, shaking his head. He was a hard man, 15 years in the teams, multiple deployments, a chest full of medals he never talked about. But right now, he looked genuinely frustrated. "You're supposed to be the best of the best. And you can't get through a door?" The candidates didn't respond. They were exhausted, demoralized, and out of ideas. One of them, a young petty officer named Jackson, had bloodied his hands trying to manipulate the locks with picks. Another, a former college wrestler named Martinez, had thrown his entire 230 pounds at the door repeatedly until his shoulder was bruised purple. "Senior Chief," one of the instructors called out, "we've got another group coming through in 20 minutes. Should we just skip this station?" Webb's jaw tightened. "No, this is part of the curriculum. They need to learn breaching under stress. We'll figure it out." That's when the sound of a mop bucket on wheels echoed down the hallway. Everyone turned to see an elderly man in gray maintenance coveralls pushing a yellow bucket, a mop propped over his shoulder like a rifle. He was in his 70s, lean and weathered, with white hair cropped military short and pale blue eyes that seemed to take in everything without appearing to look directly at anything. His name was Frank Morrison, though most people at the base just called him Frank. He'd been working as a janitor at the Naval Special Warfare facilities for the past 8 years, ever since he'd retired from, well, whatever he'd retired from. Nobody really knew. He was just the old guy who mopped the floors and emptied the trash cans and never complained about anything. Frank stopped his bucket a few feet from the group, his eyes landing on the door, then on the failed breaching equipment scattered around it, then on the exhausted, frustrated faces of the candidates. "Problem with the door?" he asked quietly. Webb turned, annoyed at the interruption. "Nothing we can't handle." "You can work around us." Frank nodded slowly. He started to push his bucket past the group, then paused. "You know," he said, his voice casual, conversational, "that particular lock system has a quirk. The manufacturer had a defect in the 2019 batch. If you hit it wrong, the whole mechanism binds up tighter." Webb frowned. "How would you know that?" "I read," Frank said simply. He continued pushing his bucket down the hall. Webb watched him go, something nagging at the back of his mind. Then he turned back to the door. "All right, let's try." "Senior Chief," Jackson interrupted, "maybe we should ask him. I mean, if he knows something about the lock." "He's a janitor," Webb said flatly. "What's he going to know about tactical breaching that we don't?" But one of the other instructors, a younger chief named Rodriguez, was already jogging after Frank. "Hey, sir, you got a second?" Frank stopped and turned. "Sure." Rodriguez gestured back toward the door. "You said something about a quirk in the lock." "I did. Do you know how to open it?" Frank was quiet for a moment, his pale eyes studying Rodriguez's face. Then he said, "Probably. Would you mind showing us?" Frank looked past Rodriguez to where Webb stood with the candidates, all of them watching now with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. "Your boss seems like he has it under control." "He doesn't," Rodriguez said bluntly. "We've been at this for almost an hour. If you know something, sir, we'd appreciate the help." Frank nodded slowly. He left his mop bucket by the wall and walked back to the door. As he approached, Webb stepped forward, blocking his path. "Listen, old-timer, I appreciate the thought, but this is a training evolution for special operations candidates. We need to solve this ourselves." "You've been solving it for 45 minutes, Frank pointed out gently. "How's that working out?" A couple of the candidates snickered. Webb's face darkened. "You think you can do better?" "I think I can open the door." "Just like that?" Just like that. Webb crossed his arms. All right. Show us then. You've got 5 minutes. When you fail, you go back to mopping and let us handle our business. Frank didn't rise to the bait. He just nodded and stepped up to the door. He ran his weathered hands over the surface, his fingers tracing the frame, the hinges, the lock mechanism. His movements were slow, methodical, professional. He pressed his ear against the door, knocked twice, listened. "You gonna magic it open with your mind, old man?" one of the candidates muttered. A few others laughed. Frank ignored them. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather tool kit, the kind that folded out to reveal various picks and tension wrenches, not standard janitorial equipment. Webb noticed. "Where'd you get those?" "Hardware store," Frank said absently. He was studying the lock now, his eyes narrowed in concentration. He selected 2 tools from the kit, inserted them into the lock, and began to work. His hands moved with surprising steadiness for a man his age, the picks dancing inside the mechanism with practiced precision. 30 seconds passed, then a minute. "This is ridiculous," Webb muttered. "He's just—" Click. The sound was subtle but unmistakable. Frank withdrew his picks, reached for the door handle, and pulled. The heavy steel door swung open smoothly on well-oiled hinges. The entire group stood in stunned silence. Frank stepped back, folding his tools and returning them to his pocket. "The trick," he said quietly, "is that this particular lock has a secondary pin that engages when you use force. You can hammer at it all day, and it'll just bind tighter. But if you understand the mechanism, you can disengage the secondary pin first, then the primary locks fall in sequence." He looked at Webb. 8 seconds, actually. But I took my time. Then he turned and walked back to his mop bucket, leaving a group of Navy SEALs staring after him in disbelief. Rodriguez was the first to find his voice. "Sir, where did you learn that?" Frank didn't turn around. "Here and there," he called back over his shoulder, and then he was gone around the corner, the squeak of his bucket wheels fading into the distance. Webb stood looking at the open door, his mind racing. That wasn't luck. That wasn't theory from a manual. That was skill. Serious skill. The kind of skill that came from years of doing it for real. "Who the hell is that guy?" Jackson asked quietly. Nobody had an answer. But Senior Chief Webb was going to find out. Later that afternoon, Webb sat in the office of Command Master Chief Daniel Cross, the senior enlisted advisor for the entire Naval Special Warfare Center. Cross was a legend. 30 years in the teams, more deployments than most operators would see in 2 careers, and a reputation for knowing everything that happened on his base. "Frank Morrison," Cross said, leaning back in his chair. "You're asking about Frank?" "Yes, Master Chief. He just picked a lock that stumped my entire breaching cadre, in 8 seconds, with tools he carries in his pocket. I need to know who he is." Cross was quiet for a long moment, studying Webb's face. "How much do you know about Delta Force?" Webb blinked at the non sequitur. "I know they exist. Elite Army Special Missions Unit. Tier 1, that's about it. Before it was called Delta, before it had a name at all, there was a group. An experimental unit. Late 1970s. They were testing concepts that eventually became the foundation for all our modern special operations forces. Hostage rescue, direct action, counter-terrorism. They were the laboratory where we figured out how to do this stuff." "What does that have to do with—" "Frank Morrison was part of that laboratory," Cross said. "One of the first, a founding member." Webb's jaw dropped. "The janitor?" "The janitor," Cross confirmed. "Frank was one of the original operators in what became Delta Force. Before there were official training pipelines, before there were manuals, before any of this was standardized, men like Frank were out there figuring it out, making it up as they went along, learning from mistakes that cost lives." "Why is he mopping floors?" "Because he's 74 years old, drawing a pension, and wanted something to do with his time. He applied for the job 8 years ago, said he missed being around operators. Nobody knew who he was. He didn't tell them. He just wanted to be useful." Webb sat back, processing this. "Does anyone else know?" A few of us. The CO knows, I know. A couple of the senior guys who've been around long enough to recognize certain indicators. But Frank doesn't advertise it. He doesn't tell war stories. He just does his job and goes home. Master Chief, with respect, if he's who you say he is, why are we wasting his experience? He could be teaching, training, consulting. Cross smiled slightly. Frank was asked, multiple times. He always declines. Says the young guys need to figure things out themselves, same as he did. Says teaching them everything would make them soft. But he just taught us how to breach that door. Did he? Or did he show you that the answer wasn't more force? That sometimes you need to step back and think instead of just hammering away at a problem? Cross leaned forward. That's the lesson, Webb. Not how to pick that particular lock, but how to approach a problem when brute force fails. Webb was quiet, understanding settling over him. Here's what I want you to do, Cross said. I want you to leave Frank alone. Let him do his job. Don't make a big deal about this. Don't turn him into some kind of legend that everyone points at. That's not what he wants. Understood, Master Chief. But, Cross added, if you happen to run into problems in your training evolutions that your cadre can't solve, and Frank happens to be nearby. He shrugged. Well, the man does know his way around a locked door. Webb smiled. Master Chief, are you telling me to use a janitor as a secret training asset? I'm telling you not to waste resources. And Frank Morrison is one hell of a resource, whether he's holding a mop or not. 3 days later, the next group of SEAL candidates faced the same breaching evolution. They struggled with the door for 30 minutes before Senior Chief Webb called a halt. All right, gather around, he told the exhausted candidates. You're doing what the last group did. You're throwing force at a problem that requires finesse. Let me tell you something about special operations. Sometimes the best operator in the room isn't wearing a uniform. Sometimes it's the guy you'd least expect. He gestured down the hall where Frank was slowly working his way toward them with his mop bucket. That man is going to walk past us in a minute. I want you to watch what happens when we ask him for help, and I want you to think about what it means to be humble enough to learn from anyone, regardless of what they look like or what job they're doing. As Frank approached, Webb stepped forward. Frank, got a minute? Frank stopped. Sure, Senior Chief. My guys are having trouble with this door. Same one you opened last week. Would you mind showing them your technique? Frank looked at the candidates, then at the door, then back at Webb. You sure? Last time you weren't too happy about me interfering. Last time I was an idiot, Webb said simply. This time I'm asking for help from someone who knows more than I do. Something changed in Frank's expression. Not quite a smile, but a softening around the eyes. Respect being acknowledged and returned. All right, he said quietly. For the next 10 minutes, Frank walked the candidates through the lock mechanism. He explained the defect in the 2019 batch, showed them how to identify the secondary pin, demonstrated the technique with his tools. He was patient, thorough, and spoke in the calm, clear voice of someone who'd taught difficult skills in high-stress situations before. The candidates listened with rapt attention. They didn't laugh. They didn't smirk. They recognized expertise when they saw it. When Frank finished and stepped back, one of the candidates, a young lieutenant named Hayes, raised his hand. Sir, can I ask you something? I'm not a sir, Frank said. I work for a living. A couple of the candidates chuckled at the old military joke. Can I ask where you learned this? Hayes pressed. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Long time ago. Different world, but the principles don't change. Locks are locks. Whether it's a fortified compound in Mogadishu or a training door in Coronado, the approach is the same. Understand the mechanism. Respect the problem. Use the right amount of force in the right place. Were you an operator, sir? I was a lot of things, Frank said evasively. Now I'm a janitor. And I've got floors to mop. He nodded to Webb and started pushing his bucket down the hall. Hayes watched him go, then turned to Webb. Senior Chief, who is that guy? Really? Webb smiled. That, gentlemen, is proof that you should never judge someone by their current job. That man has forgotten more about special operations than most of us will ever learn. And the fact that he is willing to share it with you is a gift. Don't waste it. Over the following weeks, word spread quietly through the Naval Special Warfare community. The janitor, Frank, the old guy who could do things nobody else could do. It became a kind of open secret. If you had a technical problem, a lock that wouldn't open, a weapon that wouldn't function, a piece of equipment that was broken in a way nobody could figure out, you found Frank. You asked politely, and more often than not, he'd set down his mop and fix it in a way that made it look easy. He never explained where he'd learned these skills. He never told stories about operations or missions. He just demonstrated, explained the principle, and went back to his work. The operators learned to respect that. They learned not to push. They learned that Frank's knowledge was freely given, but never demanded. One evening, as Frank was finishing his shift, he found himself approached by a man he didn't immediately recognize. Tall, fit, in his 50s, wearing civilian clothes but carrying himself with unmistakable military bearing. The man waited patiently as Frank locked up his janitorial closet. "Frank Morrison?" the man asked. "That's me. My name is Colonel James Reardon. I command a unit that doesn't officially exist. I hear you're teaching my future operators some valuable lessons." Frank studied the man's face. "Just showing them a few tricks. Nothing special." "I disagree. What you're teaching them isn't just technique, it's humility. The ability to learn from anyone. That's worth more than any skill." "If you say so, Colonel." Reardon pulled out a business card and offered it to Frank. "I'd like to make you an offer. Come work for me officially. Instructor position. Good pay. You'd be teaching the things you're already teaching, but in a structured environment." Frank looked at the card but didn't take it. "Respectfully, Colonel, no thank you." "Can I ask why not?" "Because the moment you make it official, it becomes a job. It becomes mandatory. The kids start taking notes and trying to memorize instead of understanding. What I'm doing now, it's organic. They come to me when they're stuck, when they're frustrated, when they're ready to actually learn instead of just going through the motions. That's when real teaching happens." Reardon nodded slowly. "I understand. But if you ever change your mind..." He tucked the card into Frank's shirt pocket. "The offer stands." Frank watched the colonel walk away, then pulled the card out and looked at it. There was no company name, no address, just a phone number and an email address. He tucked it back in his pocket and headed for his truck, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. 6 months after the first door incident, Senior Chief Webb was running a particularly difficult training evolution. The scenario involved a hostage rescue in a mock-up of a multi-story building. The candidates had to breach multiple doors, clear rooms, locate hostages, and extract under simulated enemy fire. It was one of the most challenging exercises in the entire training pipeline. The problem was, they were failing. Badly. The building's architect had installed security measures that the cadre couldn't overcome. Electronic locks that reset every time they were forced. Reinforced doors that absorbed explosive charges without failing. Ventilation systems that could be used for infiltration but were too small for anyone larger than a child to navigate. After 6 hours of failures, Webb made a decision. He found Frank in the break room, eating a sandwich and reading a paperback novel. "Frank, I need your help." Frank looked up. "What's the problem?" Webb explained the situation. The impossible building, the frustrated candidates, the training timeline they were falling behind on. Frank listened without interrupting. When Webb finished, he set down his sandwich and stood up. "Show me." They walked to the training building together. Frank circled it once, his eyes tracking every window, every door, every utility access point. He paused at the main entrance, running his hands over the electronic lock. Then he looked up at the roof. "You got blueprints?" he asked. Webb produced a set of plans. Frank studied them for several minutes, his weathered finger tracing lines across the paper. Then he looked up and pointed to a spot on the building's east side. "There," he said. "Service entrance. The lock is electronic, but it's tied to the main power grid. You cut power to the building, you've got a 30-second window before the backup generator kicks in. During that window, the lock defaults to mechanical failsafe. You can open it with a standard tension wrench and rake pick. How do you know it has a failsafe? Building codes. Any facility with electronic locks has to have a manual override for emergency services. The architect probably didn't think about it when he was making the building unbreachable, but the fire marshal would have required it. Webb stared at him. You figured that out just by looking at the building? And the blueprints, and 30 years of experience breaking into places I wasn't supposed to be. Frank handed back the plans. But here's the thing, Senior Chief. Don't just tell your candidates the answer. Make them figure it out. Give them the blueprints. Give them time to study. Let them work through the problem. The answer isn't what's important. The process is. Webb nodded slowly. You ever going to tell me where you really learned all this? Frank smiled. Probably not. Some stories are better left buried. He clapped Webb on the shoulder. But I'll tell you this. Every day I come to work here, I see young men and women who are trying to become the kind of operators I used to be. And every day I get to watch them grow, get better, get smarter. That's worth more than any medal or recognition I ever got. That's why I'm here. He started walking back toward the main building, then paused and looked back. Oh, and Senior Chief? That ventilation system they think is too small? It's not. You just have to know how to move. If you've got someone small and flexible on your team, teach them to think like water. Flow through spaces, don't fight them. Sometimes the impossible route is just the one nobody's tried yet. Webb watched him go, shaking his head in amazement. Then he called his training cadre together to figure out how to turn Frank's insights into a learning experience instead of just a shortcut. The candidates eventually solved the problem. It took them 2 more days, but they figured out the power grid vulnerability and the ventilation system route. When they finally completed the exercise successfully, they were exhausted but triumphant. As they filed out of the building, Frank was there, mopping the floor of the entrance hallway. He looked up as the candidates passed, gave them a small nod of acknowledgement, and went back to his work. One of the candidates, a young woman named Santos, stopped. "Thank you," she said to Frank. He looked up, confused. "For what?" "For making us think. For not just giving us the answer. My instructor said you could have opened that building in 5 minutes, but you made us spend 2 days figuring it out ourselves." Frank smiled. "You'll remember it better this way. That's the point." Santos nodded and rejoined her group. As they walked away, Frank heard one of them say, "Who is that guy anyway?" "I don't know," another replied, "but I hope I'm half that good when I'm his age." Frank went back to mopping, a quiet contentment settling over him. This was why he was here, not for recognition, not for stories, but for moments like this. Moments when he could help shape the next generation of warriors without overshadowing them. Moments when experience could be passed down in a way that made the students better, not dependent. That evening, as Frank was leaving for the day, Command Master Chief Cross approached him in the parking lot. "Frank, got a second?" "Sure, Master Chief. I've been getting reports. Seems like you've become quite the underground legend around here. The guys are calling you the janitor who knows everything." Frank grimaced. "That's not what I want." "I know, but here's the thing. You can't be that good at what you do and expect people not to notice, not forever." Cross leaned against Frank's truck. "I've got a proposition for you. Nothing official, no paperwork, just, occasionally, when we've got a particularly stubborn problem, would you be willing to sit in on our training cadre meetings? Share your thoughts? Not as an instructor, just as, I don't know, a consultant, a voice of experience." Frank was quiet for a long time. "I don't want to be that guy, Master Chief. The old-timer who sits around telling war stories and talks about how things used to be better. That's not what I'm asking for. I'm asking for the same thing you've been doing, just slightly more structured. You'd still be Frank the janitor. You'd still mop floors and empty trash cans. But once a week, You'd sit in a room with our best instructors and help us solve problems. No recognition, no publicity, just quiet expertise when we need it. Frank looked at his old truck, then back at Cross. Once a week, and I leave whenever I want if it gets weird. Deal. They shook hands. And that's how Frank Morrison, janitor and former founding member of Delta Force, became the Naval Special Warfare Center's most valuable secret weapon. The man who taught operators not just how to open doors, but how to think, how to problem solve, how to approach the impossible with patience and intelligence instead of just force. He never wore a uniform. He never got a special title. He never told his stories. But he changed the way an entire generation of special operators thought about their craft. And that, Frank thought as he drove home that night, was worth more than any medal he'd ever been offered. Years later, long after Frank had finally retired for good, a young SEAL team commander was giving a briefing to a group of new operators. They were discussing the importance of humility, of learning from unexpected sources, of never assuming you were the smartest person in the room. "Let me tell you about a janitor I knew," the commander began, and he told them about Frank Morrison, about the door that couldn't be breached until the old man opened it in 8 seconds, about the lessons learned not from manuals or formal training but from a quiet man with a mop who'd been there, done that, and had nothing left to prove. "The point," the commander finished, "is that expertise doesn't always look like you expect it to. Sometimes it's in a uniform with a chest full of medals. Sometimes it's in civilian clothes carrying a mop. Your job is to be humble enough and smart enough to recognize it either way." The operators nodded, absorbing the lesson. None of them would ever meet Frank Morrison. But his legacy, the way he'd taught an entire community to think differently, to respect experience wherever they found it, to solve problems with intelligence instead of just force, would live on in them. And, somewhere, in a small house on the California coast, an old man sat on his porch watching the sunset, knowing that the lessons he'd taught were still being passed down, still making operators better, still saving lives. That was enough. That had always been enough. Frank Morrison's story reminds us that greatness doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it mops floors and empties trash cans while quietly teaching the next generation lessons that can't be found in any manual. Sometimes the most valuable person in the room is the one nobody's paying attention to, until the moment when their expertise becomes impossible to ignore. If this story moved you, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to understand that wisdom can come from anywhere, that experience deserves respect regardless of the uniform, or lack thereof, and that the best teachers are often the ones who've done it for real. Subscribe to Human Truth Tales for more stories of quiet legends who shape the world without seeking recognition, and warriors who understand that true strength is knowing when to teach instead of prove. In the comments below, tell us, have you ever met someone whose unassuming appearance hid incredible expertise? Have you learned a life-changing lesson from someone unexpected? Share your story. Let's honor the Frank Morrisons of the world. To every veteran who continues to serve long after the uniform comes off, to every expert who teaches without ego, to every person who chooses quiet excellence over loud recognition, we see you, we learn from you, and we'll never stop sharing your stories.